How did the work begin in the 1970s as it coincided with the reopening of the investigation in Congress?
The reopening of the congressional investigation was really secondary. What had happened is that coming out of the 1976 presidential elections and the victory of the Trilateral Commission government under Brzezinski and nominally under Jimmy Carter, Lyndon LaRouche basically commissioned a comprehensive study of the global drug trade. It was very clear that one of the agenda items of this Trilateral Commission government was a push for drug legalization. And what Mr. LaRouche said is that any country that is not capable of defending its own youth population against the scourge of drug addiction has basically lost any control over its genuine national security. So myself and a number of colleagues basically spent the better part of a year doing probably the most comprehensive study ever undertaken into the international drug trade. We looked at it from the historical standpoint. We went back, for example, to the two British opium wars of the 19th century and really found that the opium wars were a cornerstone policy of the British Empire back then, and that, if anything, the Opium War objectives remained the same, but the target shifted from China to North America, especially to the United States. So we began to develop this idea that the international drug trade was a top-down phenomenon. We had access to a number of high-ranking U.S. government officials who were involved in the anti-drug effort. For example, one former CIA officer who spent 2 years in Southeast Asia tracking the flow of the opium business. He followed the planting season. He was watching physically when ships, international ships, loaded massive amounts of acetic anhydride and other precursor chemicals that are necessary to convert raw opium into heroin onto the docks. He followed the bank accounts that basically swelled up at the point that the raw opium was being sold to the initial international wholesalers. And so we assembled a comprehensive picture and concluded that the drug trade was a top-down weapon of the British Empire today, just as it was in the 19th century at the peak of the East India Company opium wars. We found that whole financial institutions were created by the British exclusively for the purpose of managing the drug trade. Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank was created in the 19th century to be the clearinghouse bank for the official British opium trade. The Pacific and Orient Steamship Company was set up as the major transportation infrastructure for the opium and heroin trade. And it went on from there. So we completed in late 1978, early 1979, the first edition of the book Dope Inc. And in the course of doing that, it became very clear to us that the Kennedy assassination was a critical event that created a radical shift in the culture of the United States. Particularly young people went from being highly motivated, extremely optimistic about their future under President Kennedy, and then suddenly that was taken away from them, and it led to the whole process of a cultural demoralization and then degeneration, and boom, at that moment, suddenly illegal drugs were flooding onto every major university campus in the United States. And the whole counterculture had very much of a correlation with the impact of the Kennedy assassination. At that time, one of our intelligence contacts had gotten among the very first copies of the Permindex manuscript written under the pseudonym William Torbit. This is back in 1978 as we were doing the kind of final phase of research on the Dope Inc. project. And several of us were able to go down to visit this contact. This Torbit manuscript at the time was very closely held. Now it's available on the internet. But at the time, there were a limited number of Xerox copies of the original typed manuscript. And so my wife and I spent 4 days at this contact's house in Georgia and literally reading through and taking extensive and copious notes on the basic storyline, which identified the company, a NATO front company called Permindex, as the major vehicle through which the Kennedy assassination was conducted. Now, of course, this was a decade after Jim Garrison, who was the district attorney of New Orleans in the late 1960s, had conducted a follow-on investigation after the shameless cover-up of the Warren Commission. And Garrison had led an investigation and ultimately indicted a New Orleans businessman named Clay Shaw, who happened to be a director of the Permindex Company out of Canada, as a co-conspirator in the assassination of Kennedy. That case went to trial. The trial was massively sabotaged from the outside by people desperate to cover up the real authorship of the Kennedy assassination. And so we followed as much as possible the Garrison work. A lot of it was contained in this Torbit manuscript. And so just in the final months of research and writing of the first edition of Dope Inc., we included a lengthy chapter, actually 2 chapters, in the original Dope Inc. book on Permindex and on the Kennedy assassination, and basically drew the conclusion that Kennedy was assassinated by the British, by British imperial circles, precisely because he represented a revival of the FDR tradition, the American system, more long-term tradition that the British absolutely despised and were terrified of. So the Kennedy assassination became, in effect, one of the instrumental stories within the overall development of the profile of Britain's Dope Inc. So all of that was going on in the late 70s. It, of course, overlapped with the fact that the House had conducted a review of all of the earlier investigations into the assassinations of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy. And that was a kind of mood of the moment backdrop. But really, we were conducting something totally different, taking a complete top-down approach and basically declaring war against the apparatus that we came to call Dope Inc. The reason we called it Dope Inc. is because in going through the basic data and statistics on the size of the international illegal drug trade, even back in the late 1970s, our conclusion was that this was one of the biggest businesses on the face of the earth, and that it had a well-organized corporate structure. The pricing structures of opium were more stable than the price of coffee or soap going from country to country. So we developed a profile that in effect showed that it was no longer called the British East India Company, but that you had a crown apparatus that functioned as a global production and trading company running the world's dope trade. And embedded within that were extensive assassination capabilities, including the network that killed Kennedy.
Could you say more about who, in the chapter Dope Inc., you go through, there's a whole section on the background of Shaw, lifting from Garrison's assistant, Flamanda, on the question that he was working as an OSS officer during World War II and essentially had loyalty there, but also Bloomfield was the head of the Special Operations Executive. And you elaborate, you go through some of the material there, which I know some of it's in the Torbett report, as you had gotten, but and you validated some of that, what was in the document there from the contact. Is there more you can say about the Torbett document, who was that put this together, who these people were, but it's really then how you validated that evidence that went into the Dope Inc. book?
The Torbett manuscript contained a lot of extremely important leads. It also had a lot of deeply ingrained flaws in it. If you were to basically simply take the Torbett manuscript at face value, then you would conclude that the assassination was largely conducted by some, right-wing revanchist anti-communist apparatus, and that it was largely an American homegrown operation. That's because you had a very interesting phenomenon. Part of the British cover-up of the Kennedy assassination was that the British themselves, at a very high level, jumped in and basically fired off the first major critique of the Warren Commission. In fact, there was a British group that had a very double-meaning title. The group was called the British Who Killed Kennedy Committee, and it was founded by Lord Bertrand Russell. And they actually had an American, I think, genuinely honest researcher named Mark Lane produced the very first book that basically, quote, exposed the cover-up of the Warren Commission. It didn't really go at the essence of the true story, because that would have never been the British intention. But they wanted to get in on the ground floor because it was so obvious to so many people that the Warren Commission study was deeply flawed, that the British had to basically throw in their own spin and basically, in line with Bertrand Russell's whole so-called anti-nuclear weapons, nuclear disarmament movement. This whole thing was to be painted as a right-wing American conspiracy run by a bunch of super rich Texas oil men and things like that. And they threw a lot of things in that were inaccurate. There was a very strong element of that kind of ideological flavor in the Torbett report, although the Torbett report was loaded with absolutely pivotal leads. Now, you've got to realize that at the same time that Garrison was doing his investigation, the French were following up on the investigation into the numerous attempts to assassinate President Charles de Gaulle. And as it happened, it was, not surprisingly, the same British networks that were involved in the Kennedy assassination who were also financing and directly participating in the assassination attempts against de Gaulle. So in 1967, a French-language newspaper in Montreal published their own account of how the very, very same Permindex networks were involved in attempting to assassinate de Gaulle as well. And they had traced some of the money conduits, the Caribbean Anti-Communist League, the OAS, the right-wing French networks that hated de Gaulle for giving independence to Algeria. These networks were all ultimately part of this British/NATO Permindex apparatus. So we were looking at a broader horizon. The Torbett manuscript was one trajectory. We took the Torbett manuscript as not the final word on the Kennedy assassination, but a source of significant leads. And what I would say is that we did the most comprehensive cross-checking of all of the names and leads and relationships presented in the Torbett manuscript. And I would say about 40% of it we just threw out because it was just incorrect or was diversionary from the main storyline. We pursued all of those leads. We found an enormous amount of corroborative information. We picked up on the French investigation as well. And also, we did the very same thing that Garrison did. We went back to the original Warren Commission report. You've got to realize that the Warren Commission report consisted of a summary volume of findings and conclusions and 24 volumes of primary documentation. And so within that 24 volumes, there were enormous leads, an enormous amount of material that in fact led you in a direction radically different than the Alan Dulles, John J. McCloy-led cover-up conclusions of the Warren Commission. The idea that it was a lone assassination by Lee Harvey Oswald was disputed by the overwhelming evidence in the Warren Commission's documentation volumes. So in other words, there was a massive amount of material. And we basically approached this from the top-down standpoint that we didn't take anything at face value. We did an enormous amount of cross-gridding and ultimately painted our own picture, drew our own evaluation that was uniquely different than the Torbet manuscript, different only in degree of looking at the bigger picture from Garrison's own conclusions. We went beyond what the French intelligence investigation showed. At one point, we made contact with a former Italian government intelligence officer who had been involved at one point in investigating the Rome offices of Permindex. Permindex was nominally based out of Montreal, Canada, but they had an office in Rome under the same basic title, Centro Mondiale Commerciale in Rome. And colleagues, or this guy himself, had actually conducted a break-in to the Permindex offices and had photographed all of the names on the Rolodex, the contact list on the desk of Giorgio Montello, who was the head of the Rome office. So we were given access to that list of names and addresses and phone numbers and folded that into our own investigation as well. And it very much intersected with leading people within the British oligarchy who Clay Shaw had intersected and collaborated with during his period during World War II, when he was actually based in London. Clay Shaw became a really radical Anglophile, was in effect recruited to the intelligence services of the British monarchy, the British oligarchy. And so when he went back to New Orleans and founded the local international trade mart in New Orleans as the local sort of branch operation of Permindex in Montreal, Centro Mondiale Commerciale in Rome, he was there as a full-fledged British agent. He had contacts with the CIA. At one point, the CIA director at the time, Richard Helms, at the time of the Kennedy assassination, was in a private meeting with a small number of senior staff. And this was after the Kennedy assassination, and probably it was during the period of the Garrison investigation and the indictment and trial of Clay Shaw. And Helms basically insisted that nobody even mention Clay Shaw's name because there were clearly connections that Shaw had to the Anglophile factions of the CIA as well. So we had the benefit of, number one, taking a complete top-down de novo approach to the investigation into the Kennedy assassination. We had a profound historical understanding of the fight between the British Empire and the American system. We had the work that we were doing for well over a year on profiling the modern expressions of the British Empire through this dope Inc. global drug trade. And so with all of those elements at play, we developed a unique evaluation of all of the critical questions relating to the Kennedy assassination. What was the motive? Who carried it out? How was it conducted? Who were the larger networks that provided the support structure for the assassination? Where did the assassins themselves come from? There was a large network of researchers, investigative journalists who had spent years studying the Kennedy assassination, and we were able to gain access to a lot of the archival material from those networks as well. At that time, there would be annual conferences, usually in Dallas, Texas, of all of the people doing various elements of new research on the Kennedy assassination. And we had the advantage that we were coming at this top down and were able to basically benefit from other people's research, but without being dragged into whatever their sort of pet theories were. Sometime relatively soon after the first edition of Dope Inc. was published, maybe within a year and a half, we were told by a long-standing EIR subscriber who happened to be a friend of Jim Garrison that he had had a discussion with Garrison about Dope Inc., and Garrison had read the book and commented that he thought that the chapter dealing with Permindex and the Kennedy assassination was probably the most accurate synopsis of what he had spent 4 years of his life investigating. So after that, I contacted Garrison. He was now a magistrate in New Orleans. He had been the district attorney. That was an elected position, and so was magistrate. So he was still an elected official down in New Orleans. I called him up, and he basically invited me and a colleague to come down and spend a few days with him and discuss these events. Now, I mean, Garrison never really gave up on pursuing the assassins of John F. Kennedy right up until his dying day. In fact, he had written a roman à clef novel about Permindex and the assassination of Kennedy called The Star-Spangled Conspiracy that had gotten very little circulation, but it was a book that we found out about. I read it. I think I still to this day have a copy in my on my bookshelf. And he made very clear that he understood that this was a larger, higher-level conspiracy. At the time that I went down to meet with him, he was also doing a draft of a nonfiction book, which ultimately was published, called On the Trail of the Assassins, which was his nonfiction account of the Kennedy assassination as he saw it. And so a colleague of mine and I were down in New Orleans for 2 or 3 days with him. I think it was probably 1981 or 1982. And we had an opportunity to go through some of his files. We had a lot of discussion back and forth. And at that time, as he was working on the manuscript for his nonfiction book, we remained in close contact. He would send chapter by chapter of his drafts. He would send a copy to Mr. LaRouche and send a copy to me, and asked for our comments, and also asked if we had any additional documentation that would further illuminate the story. And I think we provided a lot of material. The research that we had done in Europe was clearly beyond the scope of what he had the resources to do, and a lot of that material tended to just reinforce in his own mind the importance of Clay Shaw, the British connections of Clay Shaw, the fact that he was part of a kind of a wannabe network of people who were attached to some of the highest levels of the British oligarchy. And I might add that the level of the British oligarchy that he attached to was the most perverse, sexually, politically. So there was a period of years as Garrison was working on his own account, and as we were pursuing and following up and enriching our own profile of the Kennedy assassination, the strategic importance of it, the networks behind it, that there was a kind of real, synergy of his research work and ours back and forth. And I think it was extraordinarily productive, and I think led to some further breakthroughs on what really happened, why it happened, who was behind it. Now, I think the other thing in this regard is that obviously this work, first on Dope Inc. and then on Permindex, did not exactly endear us, particularly Mr. LaRouche, to the British oligarchy and their hands and feet assets here in the United States. And so much of what happened later in the 1980s, the frame-up of Mr. LaRouche and many colleagues, all of that, there were elements of it related to LaRouche's breakthrough work with President Reagan on SDI. But lurking in the background at all points in this process was the fact that we had blown the lid on the actual nature of the British Empire and the British oligarchy and had nailed it as Dope Inc. Now, I think there's one very important thing that's worth going back to in considering Garrison's work itself. There were extensive efforts launched to basically sabotage Garrison's efforts. One of the notorious figures who played a role in trying to completely discredit and trash the Garrison inquiry was Walter Sheridan, a very dark figure from the FBI Counterintelligence Division 5, from the National Security Agency, who wormed his way into some of the inner circles of the Kennedy administration. He was at the Department of Justice under Robert Kennedy when John Kennedy was president. And after Kennedy's assassination, Sheridan worked nonstop to discredit and destroy Garrison's work. And I think it's very important to realize that but for that kind of interference and a few judicial errors, whether they were intentional or just happened, it was a very, very near miss in terms of Clay Shaw being convicted of conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. As it was, Sheridan, who was working for NBC White Paper, was running a whole discrediting campaign against Garrison. But all of that would have been for naught if Clay Shaw had been convicted. There were certain critical pieces of evidence that the judge refused to allow to be introduced at trial, including the fact that Clay Shaw acknowledged that he operated under the name Clay Bertrand, and this was somebody who was in the middle of a lot of the Cuban exile paramilitary networks in New Orleans that were the immediate circle in which Lee Harvey Oswald was functioning. So there were certain things which, had they been allowed to come at trial, would have almost undoubtedly led to Clay Shaw's conviction. What would have been the implications of a conviction of a prominent member of New Orleans high society, a member of the board of Permindex, a well-known radical Anglophile, being convicted of conspiracy? Had that gone in that direction, it would have been almost impossible to keep the lid on at least critical elements of the real story of how Kennedy was killed. We might have been in a different universe today. And this is how these critical moments, these critical events, can shape the direction of history for quite some time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. What were the two guys that Gordon Noble and then Russo were both extradited out of the state?
Right, and
as
also
the key witnesses.
There was a guy named Kimball who was another key witness, and he also shows up in the investigations by the House Select Committee on the assassination of Martin Luther King. So, again, some of these critical leads were buried, but we discovered them, pursued those leads, and the main thing was that Clay Shaw had operated under a pseudonym and had been deeply involved with Guy Bannister, a former top FBI Division 5 counterintelligence division person from Chicago who retired, moved to New Orleans, and was a sort of a point person for all of the covert networks that were operating and training for the Bay of Pigs and follow-on right in the New Orleans area. And this was the network that Lee Harvey Oswald was inserted into. So Shaw was a kind of local intelligence handler, controller, babysitter for this whole extended apparatus of weirdos. David Ferry, Lee Harvey Oswald, Guy Bannister. These were all people who were, low level, but, important players in the framing of the environment for the Kennedy assassination. And so the Shaw not guilty verdict, based on evidence that was erroneously excluded, was really a kind of a key event in history, because there was a moment of opportunity right there to blow the lid off of the Warren Commission cover-up.
It is the key thing, because people, they say, well, you're just making this stuff up about Shaw, and there's all kinds of slander websites been set up to try to refute, but point by point, everything that Garrison has done.
Right. Well, as I say, I think the crucial thing with Shaw is his wartime period in London, the connections he made there. That's how he winds up on the board of Permindex. That's how he winds up being the point person for a top-down British intelligence operation, an outgrowth of the extensive wartime intelligence apparatus that was built up in Canada. And I think it's very important to remember that Montreal, Canada, has been historically used by the British as a kind of forward base for some of the nastiest operations conducted against the United States. Remember that it was to Montreal that the assassins of Abraham Lincoln fled. It was where Jefferson Davis fled after the defeat of the British secessionist plot called the Confederacy. You go to the Hudson's Bay Company original department store in downtown Montreal, and there's a bronze plaque on the door commemorating the fact that Jefferson Davis was hiding out after the defeat of the Confederacy at the Hudson's Bay Company before basically going over to England. And so Permindex being housed in Montreal, it was there because there was already a long-standing, pre-existing intelligence structure. Leading people in the British Special Operations Executive during the whole World War II period had operated out of Canada and under various of the joint Anglo-American programs once the United States came into the war. A lot of those people had moved in to Washington. Lewis Mortimer Bloomfield of British SOE, who was the president of Permindex, had been a liaison to J. Edgar Hoover in the FBI for counterespionage operations during the Second World War. So I think the point is that you had a British intelligence penetration of elements within the U.S. intelligence community. Remember, prior to the establishment of the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, the United States never had a formal government civilian intelligence agency. We had naval intelligence that was always in the kind of forefront of American global outreach and was an intelligence eyes and ears for the Republican factions through much of the history of the Republic. People like John Paul Jones being sent to Russia after the American Revolution, all of these things. But so the United States was green behind the ears in terms of sophisticated civilian intelligence operations. And so it was really like, going into a candy store for British intelligence to be recruiting and selecting from among the already predisposed Anglo-American faction of U.S. intelligence. And Shaw, having been posted in London for several years during the war, was a prime candidate. So there were all kinds of links to the CIA, absolutely. But if you want to say, where did the plot originate? What was the mother lode of the apparatus that killed Kennedy? It was British, not American. And the fact that you had some traitors on the U.S. side who were willing to be complicit before, during, and after, especially the devastating impact of the Warren Commission cover-up. And the fact that some of the people who served on the Warren Commission didn't live to survive because they were dissidents, they were patriotic dissidents who opposed what Dulles and John J. McCloy were trying to do to basically run a cover-up that would demoralize the American people following off of the terrible shock impact of the Kennedy assassination itself.
Yeah, I think the key, just to put a couple more things on that, the key issue that I find that is needed to understand and cut through all of this stuff against Garrison and the whole Clay Shaw trial, and not a lot of that went into the JFK film. The JFK film is largely based on that book. Is the section of the book which, as you say, was put in there because of what you were sending him, that Clay Shaw is part of Permindex, but that Permindex was then found by de Gaulle to be the group that financed part of this OAS group. And there's the part on that, which is also in the Torbett report, which is this guy named Gatlin being sent by Guy Bannister from the New Orleans office to Paris.
Right.
Can you say something more about the connection of Permindex to the de Gaulle assassination?
Well, Permindex was found directly through Gatlin and through money that Permindex was conduiting through the Caribbean into the hands of the OAS assassins, attempted assassins of de Gaulle. There's another element of this whole story that came in at a later point, but which I think is unique to our overall top-to-bottom research on this, which is that it's very, very likely, almost a certainty, that the assassins of Kennedy, the actual assassins, were Spanish or French OAS professional trained killers who came into Texas via Mexico, came up into Dallas, did the assassination, and as everybody was running after Lee Harvey Oswald, the patsy and the diversion, they were able to escape back through Mexico and out from there. So in other words, what did you have? You had a global apparatus, ultimately a British intelligence-controlled Murder, Inc. apparatus that had a number of key bases of operation, areas where they could operate with impunity because they were protected top-down. You had Montreal, the overall headquarters of this Permindex apparatus. You had New Orleans, which was the outpost, critical outpost here in the United States. You had various places in the Caribbean. You had Montego Bay in Jamaica that was a kind of a retirement residence for a number of leading figures in the British high-level oligarchy, people who had come out of World War II intelligence, and critical meetings discussing the assassination plan against John F. Kennedy took place in basically elite retirement areas in Montego Bay, in Jamaica. Then you had Algeria, where you had an apparatus of old French right-wing colonialists who were part of the military apparatus that waged a dirty war in Algeria for decades. And ultimately, it was de Gaulle's conclusion that that dirty war was going to destroy France that led him to give Algeria its independence. And that caused a tremendous backlash against de Gaulle. So you had a whole French apparatus of assassins, and many of them were Foreign Legion types who were picked up from all over the world. That apparatus was a capability in place. In all likelihood, it was 3 shooters from that apparatus who were in Dallas and did the actual triangulated killing of Kennedy and escaped. So it's a global nexus, but at the top, it's British-controlled, with allied networks, complicit networks in France, in the United States, in Mexico. You had a whole right-wing evangelical apparatus under the cover of the American Council of Christian Churches that ran orphanages and missionary operations in Mexico that were a cover for these assassination capabilities. So it was a global apparatus. Now, just before his death, President Lyndon Johnson gave a last interview to Atlantic Monthly. The interview was done by an old Texas journalist, an old friend of his. And in his last published interview, he recounted the fact that he came into the presidency after Kennedy's assassination, and he said, "I knew I had crosshairs on the back of my neck from the moment that I was sworn in on that plane flying back to Washington." And he said, "I tried to get to the bottom of it. I looked into it, and all I could come up with was the conclusion that we had, quote unquote, a goddamn murder Inc. operating out of the Caribbean that was responsible for the Kennedy assassination and many other things." So even in his own mind, Johnson knew that there was this sort of out-of-control, rogue intelligence apparatus that he couldn't put his finger on. As President of the United States, he couldn't crack down on it. But he knew it existed, and he knew his life was in danger. So if you want to know why Johnson reversed Kennedy's decision not to go into Vietnam and to actually withdraw the small number of U.S. troops that were already there on the ground, this is the reason why. He knew that there were guns pointed at his head. He knew there was an assassination capability that he couldn't control or stop. And if you look at the events of the follow-on years, the picture's absolutely clear. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, all killed within a short span of years. It was the most intensive unleashing of high-level political assassinations, probably at any time since the Roman Empire. So that's what you're dealing with here. So yeah, there was a French component to it. There was a Spanish fascist component to it that operated out of Spain, still under Franco. And so this apparatus was sort of fungible. They could move around. They were interchangeable. But who issued the kill order? That came from the highest levels of the British oligarchy, for the reasons that we know. That Kennedy represented a dangerous revival of the United States of the founders, the United States of Abraham Lincoln, the United States of Franklin Roosevelt. And if the United States in the 1960s went into that kind of surge ended the Cold War with the Soviet Union, which was a big issue on Kennedy's agenda. His famous speech in June of 1963 at American University. That's where Ronald Reagan got the initial term strength through peace through strength. And so Kennedy was moving in a number of directions. The Apollo program, bringing the Fed under control, reissuing U.S. Treasury bills for the first time, out of Vietnam. All of these things, particularly going with the Apollo project to create a science driver and a degree of optimism that would last for generations. All of these were the reasons that Kennedy had to be killed, and it was a top-down decision of the oligarchy headquartered in London. And they reached into their doping apparatus to do it.
Can you say, I want you to do a short thing on your interview with Fletcher Prouty, just to lead into that. And you'd mentioned, because he brings up the Murder Inc. also. You have that news article in that interview highlighted.
Right. Well, I think the relationship with Fletcher Prouty went way, way, way beyond just simply that interview. That interview was a culmination of a collaboration with Fletcher that ran for, decade or more. He had written a very important book in the 1960s, I think, called The Secret Team, which basically went through the fact that embedded within the post-World War II formation of a civilian permanent intelligence apparatus, that embedded within that was a nasty secret apparatus that was operating outside the framework of the Constitution and outside of the framework of law. And so his expose of that was extremely important in terms of laying bare some of the parameters of this British penetration and corrupting of our intelligence institutions. And Fletcher at that time didn't particularly focus on the British element of it, but identified it as a corrupting factor within the U.S. intelligence community. He had been in World War II, had been a pilot in the Pacific Theater. He knew that at the end of World War II, we were flying weapons into Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam because the United States was still under the FDR view of decolonization, national liberation, and helping these nations to stand up as true sovereigns. And of course, Ho Chi Minh modeled his own revolution on the American Revolution and on the framework of the U.S. Constitution. And it wasn't until the mid-50s, under the influence of the Dulles brothers and others, that we basically abandoned the cause of these liberation movements and instead adopted the policy of supporting the European empires as a form of stability once we got into the Cold War with the Soviet Union. So Prouty knew that whole history personally. And he also, at a certain period of time in the late 1950s, was the head of what was called the Focal Point Office. This was a unit at the Pentagon that provided logistical support to the CIA. Back then, before the full engagement in the Vietnam War, the CIA did not have a lot of paramilitary assets. They didn't have their own covert air force or things like that. And so when the president approved CIA covert operations, he would basically authorize the CIA to carry out these things, and then the CIA would go to the Focal Point Office at the Pentagon with a shopping list of assets and resources that they needed to have temporarily put at their disposal. So Fletcher Prouty was in an instrumental position to see the evolution and growth of this sort of cancerous structure within our intelligence community, and he wrote about it courageously. We got to know him very, very well, and at a later point in the early 90s, he went one step further and wrote a sequel to Secret Teams that focused on the Kennedy assassination. And after a lot of years of interaction, he had a much more kind of sophisticated and refined understanding of how the events that he had lived through were a reflection of a top-down growing power of a system of oligarchism and radical Malthusianism. So Prouty was a critical character, not a major, player in terms of a lot of time on screen, but the Mr. X character who basically met with Jim Garrison and provided Garrison with certain critical information substantiating the fact that he was on the right course in his investigation and to keep going and push it further, and provided some crucial leads. Prouty played that role in providing crucial little assist and encouragement and shove forward for Garrison's investigation. And we talked about those things on many, many occasions quite extensively. And when his second book came out, we took the opportunity to have an on-camera dialogue interview format back and forth. It was really quite inspiring.
I wanted to ask you about, Johnson says this thing about the Murder Inc. Of course, then they get, there's the massive cover-up, bullying. Hal Boggs, apparently, according to Gallagher, from 1963, right away knew the Warren Commission was bogus.
Oh, absolutely.
And he knew Hoover was getting secret briefings from everybody beforehand and making sure that they knew what they were going to ask the FBI and so forth. But anyway, so he is killed in 72, months after he calls for Hoover's resignation in 1972 in Congress, on the floor of the Congress.
Right. Sure.
So you have that. He inspired this guy Lowenstein, Allard Lowenstein.
Oh, sure.
He's shot in 1980 8 times in his law office.
Right.
But he was I think he helped open it up with Frank Church. And then you have all these guys in 78, 79 who are assassinated. So it seems there's just this wave, and they succeeded in silencing and murdering anyone who is going to do that. So I don't know if you want to say something about that period leading into our picking it up was this mass death through the 70s, 78, 79. And then just a final clip, I guess we can pull on it later, but sort of, what is this apparatus doing now today?
Mm-hmm. Garrison obviously followed the assassination of Kennedy. And when the Warren Commission report came out, one of the things that became pretty obvious is that a whole bunch of players who were involved with Lee Harvey Oswald were all from New Orleans. Remember, Oswald was living in New Orleans right up to the time of the Kennedy assassination, on and off. He had been in Dallas, he was in New Orleans, but there was a whole circle of people who were very familiar to Garrison. And so he did the responsible thing. He spent quite a period of time literally reading through all 25 volumes of the Warren Commission report. He read through it several times and extracted all of the evidence that was contained in the volumes of the raw, interview transcripts, things like that, and basically developed a subset of the Kennedy assassination story that all took place in his jurisdiction in New Orleans. Now, if you ever get a chance to physically go down to New Orleans, some of these buildings have been destroyed, but I was down there several times and had a chance to walk around to see the office on Camp Street, where Guy Bannister had his office, where it was a corner building. And one side of the building, you entered on Camp Street and went up to Bannister's office. There was a side entrance on the other perpendicular street that led up to the offices of the left-wing front group, the pro-Castro organization that was ostensibly what Oswald was involved in as part of his cover, being sheep-dipped into some communist agent. That was to be the big story behind why Kennedy was killed, and to blame it on Cuba and the Soviets, and of course all of that whole Oswald legend. But when you see all of this, you get an idea that these events, these people were rubbing elbows and were operating in extremely close proximity to one another. And so, yeah, it took years. Garrison began investigating. And even before the period of the 1970s, the death of Hale Boggs and the plane crash, other things, even as the investigation by the Warren Commission was playing out, many people were being killed. Key witnesses were being killed. I think the list runs into the 20s or more of people who might have given critical little pieces, who were eyewitnesses to something that would have been an anomaly that broke the cover-up. And many of these people were killed. It made Garrison's work that much more difficult. Even at a certain point, David Ferrie was dead. So, who was one of the instrumental players, rubbing elbows with Lee Harvey Oswald, working with the whole Cuban exile apparatus, running guns, the whole relationship between Guy Bannister and Jack Ruby, who was the assassin of Oswald. This whole story is littered with dead bodies, and every time there would be an upsurge of interest and potentially new information coming out, you'd have another whole bunch of people being killed. Aled Lowenstein was one of the people who was working very closely with Bobby Kennedy. And of course, had Bobby Kennedy been elected president in 1968 and survived as president, you would have had a whole different directionality of where the United States went. We might have actually seen, since we're talking 67 was the Garrison investigation and trial, 68 had Robert Kennedy been elected president and not been assassinated. These were fresh leads at the time. People were still around. Clay Shaw was around. This could have gone in a completely, wholly different direction. Lyndon Johnson had quietly asked Ramsey Clark to reopen the Kennedy assassination investigation, and we don't know what all happened there, but Clark obviously got basically threatened and scared off. We don't know. He's never really said anything about it that I'm aware of, but he came back and said there was nothing new. Maybe he knew that key witnesses had already been bumped off or might be bumped off, but so, yeah, there's been a trail of corpses that goes back to the beginning and runs all the way through, because fundamentally, the apparatus is still intact. If anything, it has been vastly expanded. And I go back again to the very first point that we talked about, which is Dope Inc. Where was Dope Inc. in the 1970s? Or in the 1960s at the time of the Kennedy assassination, compared to where it is today. We didn't have massive drug cartels pretty much running roughshod in Mexico. We didn't have the FARC and the other Medellin and Cali cartels in Colombia. We didn't have the Russian mafia as another major element of global Dope Inc. We didn't have this narco-terrorism coming out of the Islamic world in the aftermath of the Afghan war. So what exists today as part of Britain's Dope Inc. is vastly larger than it was at the time of the Kennedy assassination and cover-up. So the capability is not only intact and in place, but it's vastly larger, it's better funded. We've been through a 30-year period of perpetual wars, asymmetric wars, big wars. So you've got an army of people who were the equivalent of the OAS, who fought against the independence of Algeria, who fought the dirty war against the Algerian independence movement. They were small relative to the pool of cold assassins that run around the world today and are available ultimately at the disposal of this British dope inc apparatus.